Madam Mayor, are you ready to begin the meeting? Hi. Okay.
Recording in progress.
Good evening and welcome to the Petaluma City Council and the Petaluma Community Development Successor Agency regular meeting of Monday, December 5th. May we have roll call, please?
Barrett.
Here.
Barnacle.
Here.
Fisher.
Here.
Healy.
Here.
King.
Here.
McDonald.
Here.
Kosuke.
Here.
All members are present.
Thank you. And the closed session item is public employee performance evaluation pursuant to paragraph 1 of subdivision B of California Government Code, section 54957. The titles are city attorney and city manager. And it's scheduled to go from 5:30 to 6:30, but I expect this will run over and we will return to the regular meeting at the end of our closed session meeting, or 6:30, whichever comes last. Okay. So with that, is there any public comment on the closed session item?
We are now taking public comment for the closed session item. If there's anyone in the virtual audience who would like to speak, please raise your virtual hand or press star 9. And I do see one attendee, Paul G. I'm going to allow you to speak. You should be able to unmute yourself and address the council.
Yes, thank you very much, Council, for giving me these 3 minutes. It's very important that we address these issues because they involve both of the people that you're reviewing. They involve Mr. Danley and they involve Ms. Flynn. You're reviewing the personnel. Now, that you have to actually judge it by their record. And so what we are going to do is we're going to give you more evidence so you can judge the record accurately. So what do we have? We have a letter from Mr. Danley written to me on February 28th, 2022. And it was actually copied to the Honorable Mayor and Petaluma City Council members, Peggy Flynn, Heather Hines, and Ken Savano. We have reviewed this letter in detail and have proof of the false statements made by Mr. Danley in this letter. This is a problem when your city attorney makes provably false statements in a letter intended to try to take away rights away from a resident of Petaluma who pays their taxes and has every right to participate in their government in any way, shape, or form. This is all about a protection racket in order to try to cover their own tracks. But the evidence will prove to you that what is in this letter is not true, and that should have direct impact on his ongoing personnel review, as well as that to City Manager Flynn, because this is happening on her watch as well. So the evidence will come forward in the way of recordings from the Petaluma Police, and so we have reviewed them, and we know exactly what went down and how it disproves what Mr. Danley has written. And so we are going to present all of this evidence in the public record to ensure that the names are cleared when they need to be, and the parties perpetrating lies will actually then have to account for them. Now, this is assuming that we have a system that cares about the truth and cares about not actually bullying and beating up people. And so we want to make sure that this incoming city council takes a look at this matter very seriously. Now, one other person that maybe should recuse himself from this would be Mr. Healy, who we understand has taken some signs that were not his in the last election and somehow got some kind of special treatment by the district attorney, so there's no matter coming forward on this. At the end of the day, we all have to be looking at the same laws, and we all have to do the right thing. Mayor Glass did the right thing back in 2018 by recusing himself on a particular matter because he had a conflict of interest and walked out the door. He was not asking for special treatment. All of our public representatives who are voted in should have the same kinds of morals and same kinds of principles. Mr. Danley, and Mr. Healy, I would invite you to please step down from your office. You've served long enough, and I think perhaps maybe you should give someone else a chance to serve. Thank you.
There's no one else on the virtual?
That's our last public comment.
Okay, thank you. And there's no one in the council chamber. So with that, we'll close public comment on this item, and the council will adjourn to the closed session. Thank you. Galvez and Monica Aparicio to provide information for those who want to listen in Spanish.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Hola, me llamo María Galvez y estoy aquí con mi pareja de interpretación, Mónica Aparicio. Estamos hoy como intérpretes. Hoy este evento se llevará a cabo en español e inglés. Se usarán ambos idiomas activamente, así que usted podrá elegir un canal para participar en su idioma preferido después de que le hayamos explicado cómo funcionará la interpretación. Estaremos usando la función de interpretación de Zoom. Después que termine esta explicación, se activará la función de interpretación. Si usted está conectado con su computadora, usted verá un icono de un mundo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Si usted está conectado con su tableta o teléfono, pulse en más y verá un menú que incluye la opción de interpretación de idiomas. Para escuchar la interpretación, pulse el icono del mundo o interpretación de idiomas. A continuación, elija su canal de idioma, por favor. We're ready.
Thank you very much. And now we will do the roll call.
Barrett,
Present.
Barnacle,
Here.
Fisher,
Here.
Healy,
Here.
King,
Here.
McDonald,
Here.
Kosake.
Here.
All members are present.
Thank you. And now we will stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. We will now have a moment of silence in memory of two people we have lost this past week. As a city, we are grieving the loss of one of our staff, Josh Bocci, a water treatment operator at our Ellis facility, who has been part of the city staff since 2010. We're sending our love and support to his family and coworkers. In addition, we're joining our entire community here in Petaluma and in Sonoma County, and probably around much of California, in the recent death of Lucy Cordum, who was very transformative in terms of the environmental consciousness in our county, along with her husband, the late Bill Cordum, and the fundamental work they have done for public access to open space and the coastal areas of our state. So we will be closing our meeting in memory of both of those people, and we'll now have a moment of silence. Thank you. There are no agenda changes or deletions to the current agenda, and there is no report out of closed session. So now we're going to general public comment, and this is for comment on items that are not on today's agenda. And I have several for general public comment from people who are at the city council meeting and attending in the city hall chambers. I will ask our moderator to see if there's anybody in the virtual audience who would also like to speak on general public comment.
At this time, I will start a 30-second clock for general public comment. Members of the public attending in person should bring their speaker cards to the clerk's desk if they have not already done so. Members of the public attending online or by phone should raise their virtual hand or press star 9 if participating by phone. Madam Mayor, we have 5 virtual hands raised.
Okay, 5 people. Okay, 1, 2. So that's 11 people. So that's 2 minutes per person. Okay, so I'm going to start with the people in the council chambers. Each person has 2 minutes, and then we will go to the people on the Zoom audience. Thank you. So starting with Peter Cherneff, followed by Peter Howley.
Another beautiful day in Petaluma. Green Beret Surgeon Dr. Jeffrey McDonald still in prison after 50 years for whistleblowing Bush's heroin ops. Leonard Peltier, 47 years down. And a prophecy from the ultimate code talker from 2,000 years back, Yeshua, whose spirit be alive and almighty, be present here and now. A prophecy that sets the world free by freeing Leonard Peltier via the 40-day strike begins this full moon. CSPOA President Sheriff Richard Max states, corruption is killing America. Meanwhile, in a government overtaken by Bar Association lawyers already urinating on the Constitution, you also have Trump now calling for a suspension of the Constitution. What health official has accepted the $1 million to debate Robert Kennedy of the Children's Defense Fund? What health official speaks at all about the common use of euthanized pets, including all their vaccines and human cadavers, into the grinder mix, becoming meat filler fed to cows, chickens, cats, dogs, and people, delivering disease and cancer to people and pets? Santa Rosa's police dog, Colt, just died of cancer at the age of 7. Meanwhile, USDA inspectors are paid to hide all the pus-filled, tumorous, cancer-filled animals at the slaughterhouse. And in Sonoma County, how many cancer clinics and monies between insurance companies and bar lawyers are going on? Unto Peter were given the keys, so to the law to put the world to its knees. I am Commander Peter Alexander. I am commanding my military of soldiers, veterans, warriors, students, and angels to shut down every asset, every facet of the God-agreed mammon by the prophecy's 40-day freedom strike, freeing all innocents, all Leonard Peltier, our U.S. Constitution, and us, beginning.
Thank you, Peter Howley, followed by Bob Homson.
Good evening. I'm not nearly as exciting as that Peter Alexander, though my name is also Peter Alexander. I'm not related to him. I just want to thank you for serving our city that my wife and I love. We want to become part of it. If any of you think I can be helpful, ask. The answer is yes. And keep up doing the good work, and of course, do better good work. But thank you for being where you are.
Thank you. Bob Homson, followed by Michael Shapiro.
Good evening, everybody. To everybody, I wish the very best in health and spirit. My name's Robert Hanson, vet, retired carpenter, grandpa. Our country is under global assault on all fronts. What was 22 months ago a question is now a fact. The vote count in the 2020 election was massively manipulated. That carried it through the 2022 election. The result of that is we have an ungodly, unlawful president and administration that is aggressively and with intent destroying the prosperity, security, and integrity of the United States of America. We have a governor that wants to turn the state of California into the national destination for abortion. If we learned anything from the abortion, from the AIDS epidemic, safe sex is the only moral answer to unwanted pregnancy and disease. Yet that's not even in the conversation. We have a governor that wants to turn the state of California into the national destination for child gender mutilation. These are children. I'm going to cut right to the chase. If my city council will draft formal charges, treason against the United States of America on 3 counts, Joe Biden and his administration have committed treason against the United States.
Michael Shapiro, followed by Lori Schroeder.
Hi, I'm Michael Shapiro, 14-year Petaluma resident. I've been working with neighbors for the past year or two, discussing the issue of leaf blowers, gas-powered leaf blowers in our town and what we can do about it. There are myriad reasons to follow the lead of other cities, such as Washington, D.C., Palo Alto, Larchmont, New York, that have restricted or curtailed the use of gas-powered leaf blowers. Most obvious is the noise issue. It's also a social justice issue. These are people very often who have very few other employment opportunities. They're suffering from damaged hearing. They are suffering from higher incidences of lung cancer, according to the California Air Resources Board. Leaf blowers and what they call SOARs, which are also lawnmowers, are producing as much pollution in our state as all the cars in our state. That's California Air Resources Board. Washington, D.C. started banning them as of January 1st this year. My colleague, James Fallows, who was a former speechwriter for President Jimmy Carter, has said the change in the city is tremendous. There's so much more peace, quiet. The feeling that we have a better standard of living is enhanced. And I just wanted to mention a couple of other things. I thought I had 3 minutes, so I'll try to keep it to 2. Those of us who work remotely have a much harder time working on Zoom when there's blaring leaf blowers. It can wake people up who work all night, people who work in grocery stores, people who work in hospitals, such as nurses and doctors. So there's myriad reasons. I've spoken with Councilmember Fisher and Councilmember McDonald about this, and
Lori Schroeder, followed by Catherine Bobowski. And the other members of the public who are here in the city council, if you could keep the voice level down, please. Thank you. Go ahead, Ms.
Hi.
Schroeder.
Now, call. Okay, you have letters about Catherine Borowski's mobile home park. It all went to all of you, plus you got pictures of it. So what I'm trying to do is to get her manager out completely, that's doing drugs in there and everything else. Dogs are on a leash, everything is really messed up, but everything's in my letters though, that you all have. So that really explains it all, as much as I can.
Okay.
So I'm asking you and everybody else to let that manager go along with her family, her friends. Get a real manager in there that can fix everything. So that's all I was trying to say. But the letters explain it all. Plus we have the picture, so does her attorney, Evan Levinstone. Because right now I can't even stay there for 3 days if I had to, because her manager's gonna be knocking on her door to get me out right away, along with the other two with her pastor and everything. So I don't know, with my autism, I was trying to help her out with all this being a witness for it. So things are that bad. So that's what we're asking for, to see if you have a way of getting to the owners and have them evict all those people out of there. start over. That's all I have to say. So my letters will explain that to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And Catherine Brabowski.
Yes, I live at Lewis Multivilla Moon Park. The other night, I caught the manager's friends, space 14, illegally parked against my mobile home with vehicle license plate 8J49014, and goes over to 14, comes back to my mobile home at 31, dealing his illegal drugs right up against my mobile home. I took a picture of it, and I sent it to my attorney. And yesterday, too, he came back. It starts doing the same thing again. And this manager has been, the cops, the Petaluma Police Department, say they're not going to respond, and they're going to allow this manager and their family and their friends to be breaking the law. They park on the far lanes, they do vandalism in there, they trespass, and like I said, 14 was dealing drugs in there, right up against my mobile home the other night. I took a picture of it, and I sent it to my attorney. And this is the owner's address and phone number. This has been gone way too long. That park is not being maintained at all. So I'm dropping this off. And also, too, the Petaluma Transit System is not, they stop their buses earlier than they're supposed to. And again, the Petaluma Police Department doesn't want to go out there because they're friends with this manager and her friends and family. Do something about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we will go to the people who are on the virtual, or in the virtual queue for general public comment.
Diana Kingsbury, I will now allow you to speak. You can address the council.
Thank you. Good evening, council members and staff. My name is Diana Kingsbury, and I am a staff member with the Sonoma County Tenants Union and North Bay Organizing Project. I'm here to request that the Residential Tenancy Protection Ordinance, which is subject to expire March 1st, 2023, be agendized no later than January 9th, 2023. This is really critical so that the new city council has enough time to consider a replacement ordinance or continue the existing ordinance before it sunsets. The sunset date was inserted to ensure that this ordinance be amended with urgency rather than to let it expire. As the council that passed these crucial tenancy protections, I urge you to ensure that this comes up in time for the new city council to consider it. We have heard from many Petaluma tenants about really terrible abuses by landlords, from price gouging to not making repairs, that really demonstrates the unfair power dynamic at play between landlords and tenants. And this makes all the more necessary these common sense protections. From the beginning, when tenants are having to obviously pay extremely high rents, they're often being charged for things they don't want or need, really being nickeled and dimed at every turn. And then with what little is left in their paychecks, often they're having to pay for their own repairs that the landlords are neglecting to make. We hear about month-long waits for repairs. Dealing with mice, rats, no response from their landlords. And yet the rent and all these other charges on top of that keep piling up every month. And tenants have to pay the consequences if anything goes wrong on their end. But on the other hand, they can't often challenge their landlord's mistreatment for fear of eviction. And so you have this opportunity to continue this progress to make sure that your workforce, families, and really the most vulnerable citizens in Petaluma don't have to suffer this really unfair power dynamic any further. Thank you.
Paul G., I'm going to allow you to speak. You should be able to unmute yourself and address the council.
Good evening, Council. Thank you for the time. 2 topics in 2 minutes. First one, I invite everybody to go to a very important website and take a look at a couple of videos. The website is preventgenocide2030.org. That's preventgenocide2030.org. And you will see 2 videos featured right up front. One is from Australian Senator Gerard Rennick, his speech about the hypocrisy of the COVID-19 so-called vaccines. The next one is a documentary released on November 21st called Died Suddenly. It has over 12.5 million views and was supported by Children's Health Defense. Now, everybody has to face the facts where we are here. We have about 43,000 plus excess deaths per month in the United States compared to, say, a period from 4 years ago. And a lot of this is tied directly to the numbers of shots and boosters that are being recommended to people. It's very important that everyone wrap their minds with what's going on. We need to stop the shots. We need to say no to any digital control ID, such as a vaccine passport. And we need to exit the WHO and the UN, because the WHO right now today is meeting to amend the international health regulations to take away US sovereignty and to be able to declare pandemics anytime they wish, based on one man's opinion. And it doesn't matter because all member states have to go along. Topic number 2, about April of this year, you passed some kind of ordinance that allowed the city staff to start handling very important decisions with regards to cell tower placements. That's very unfortunate because they're not trained to do it. I'm looking at some very incomplete applications by Dish that are missing complete important things from the applications, yet the city is approving these. They are not properly trained to actually manage these applications, which is why the public needs to get involved to put them on the straight and narrow. Please fix this broken process. Thank you.
Darren Recusen, I'm going to allow you to speak. You should be able to unmute yourself and address the council.
Thank you. And this evening, I'm going to speak about deciding our strategy definitively on last mile delivery of broadband service, with those two options being either fiber optic delivery or wireless 5G delivery. Back in May, we reviewed the fiscal year budget for the upcoming year, and it showed for the one item that made my eyebrows raised, the city's attorney's office top priority listed in that budgetary document was rewriting Petaluma's wireless ordinance. Also, to point out what the last speaker mentioned, cell towers are being approved through conditional use permit being processed ministerially by the planning department. There were 2 new cell towers put up in the past year I just learned about that I don't think received much fanfare or public input. So alongside these pieces of information that seem to indicate the city wants to pursue a wireless or 5G broadband delivery strategy, we also have the $18 million AMI grant the Public Works received, and they initially planned to deploy 5G transmitters on water meters throughout the city. And speaking with Christopher Bolt, I was hoping to push us toward at least exploring a fiber optic option, use those funds to deploy fiber optic infrastructure for these advanced metering infrastructure for the water meters. So wireless delivery of last mile broadband service and the specter of 5G towers is a contentious issue for a reason. The impact for humans, and maybe more importantly for the flora, fauna, and fungi in our ecosystem, are definitively underexplored. You can't say that we know the effects. The technology hasn't been around long enough. So given the massive ecological impacts this technology could have, I don't see how we can reconcile wanting to be an environmentally friendly city and still committing to 5G technology. So we need council and staff to openly state the strategy for our last mile broadband deployment. And I'm asking us to commit to fiber optic and not 5G.
Chad Bola, I'm going to allow you to speak. You should be able to unmute yourself and address the council.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, council members and staff. My name is Chad Bola, and I'm a renter and a tenant organizer with the North Bay Organizing Project. Over this last weekend, I joined Sonoma County Acts of Kindness volunteers on their delivery route to offer food and water to unsheltered folks, many of whom were in vehicles. Even met a family of 8 who had to do rotations regarding who could sleep in the vehicle and who had to sleep outside in the cold and rain that evening, while doing their best to maintain some degree of dignity despite their vulnerability. Many people offered deep gratitude for the small and temporary gesture of a sandwich and water. I myself struggled to hold back tears of anger and sadness the whole time, thinking about the many hardworking and socially responsible tenants I'm organizing with whose greatest fear is their landlord banishing them and their families to the streets. We can and should do much better to keep our neighbors' house. If we truly believe that housing is a human right, as I've heard publicly from certain Sonoma County decision makers, then we must commit to putting that belief into policy. This is why I request that the Residential Tenancy Protection Ordinance, which is subject to expire March 1st, 2023, be agendized no later than January 9th, 2023. This is critical so that the new city council has enough time to consider a replacement ordinance or continue the existing ordinance before it sunsets. To the council members that championed the passing of the ordinance back in September, I want to remind you that this is part of your legacy, and it demonstrates that you are on the side of working people, families, and our most vulnerable community members. I urge you to ensure that this comes up in time for the new city council to consider it. Thank you very much.
Excuse me. Lastly, Taryn Obaid, I'm going to allow you to speak. You should be able to unmute yourself and address the council.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the two commenters about the two brand new cell towers that are being erected up in Petaluma. The City Council, will you please put on the very next agenda an IZO edit that makes cell towers have to go through the Planning Commission and the City Council? When you moved the conditional use permit decision-making to staff, that moved all of the cell tower approvals except for something that might be proposed for a historic property to the staff. And the staff has, that was in June, I think, that they got that. And it wasn't until a couple of weeks ago when I asked, what are the projects that are being ministerially approved, that these two cell towers were published on the city website. One of them was a project months before the staff got this new authority. So why did they keep it quiet for months? A brand new cell tower. They didn't do a drive test for these. They didn't do dropped call logs. It's a very complicated, complex issue, cell towers. We need to track the cumulative electric draw as well as EMF radiation, which M Group staff promised to our city council that they had about 2 years ago, but they still haven't delivered it. We have no cumulative tracking of what's going on. Yet we're telling people they can't put in gas stoves, that they have to go electric. It seems like we're really overlooking wasting a lot of energy, and doesn't quite work with our climate goals. Regardless of what the issue is, please don't let staff make decisions. The public needs.
Thank you. Your time has expired. And Madam Mayor, that concludes the general public comment during the 30 seconds that their hands were raised.
Thank you very much. And with that, we will close general public comment and we will go to council comment. And I will start with Councilmember King.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Since our last meeting, Sonoma Clean Power Authority Board met. There are a number of items on our agenda, but one of interest to the public, I think, or of larger interest to the public, is that the board approved new customer rates to be implemented in the new year after the PG&E changes to the PCIA, which is their charge to our customers from contracts that existed pre the advent of CCAs, community aggregate choices. So the customer bills are set to be 5% below PG&E's bundled service total bills. All rate classes, and there are many, are to be reset so that Sonoma Clean Power customer total bills have an equal percentage difference from PG&E's bundled service total bills. So that will be implemented at some point either in January or February, depending on the timing of approval of PG&E's new rates for the PUC. in front of the PUC. So that was the main thing, and that is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councilmember McDonald?
Thank you very much. Let's see, since our last meeting, I have not had any of the committee assignments being held, but this week is a busy week. And I just wanted to note that the Pedestrian Bicycle Advisory Committee will be hearing the Rainier demonstration project for different bike lanes. And I hope people with concerns on that will tune in on December 7th for that discussions, public discussions. Also, the Oversight Committee for the County Tax Measure O for mental health meets this week. And so that ought to be an interesting update for both their revenue and their expense plans. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll go to the Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The Continuum of Care Board trying to get a lot of work done these last 2 months of the year before 2/3 of the board approximately turns over. We gave final approval to 2 memoranda of understanding with the County of Sonoma regarding them being lead agency and collaborative applicant for applying for state and federal grants related to homelessness. We're also hoping to have final ratification by the end of December, or by December 22nd, actually, of the countywide strategic plan for homelessness, as well as some new templates to help us evaluate different programs, such as different permanent supportive housing programs. I hate the term against each other, but that's what I'm saying. So we can rank which types of programs are working the best for the outcomes we're looking for. That's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember Healy.
Thank you. A couple things. The League of California Cities leadership met last week for, on Thursday, something called League Leadership, and then on Friday was the smaller group, the Board of Directors, and came up with the League of Cities 2023 advocacy priorities. And I know this group has had so much fun with 7 of us trying to whittle down to 10 top priorities. Imagine being in a room with 150 people and trying to come up with 4 priorities. It was, yeah. So they're very broad general categories. Number 1, in no particular order, but they're numbered 1 through 4. Number 1 is protect and expand investments to prevent and reduce homelessness. Number 2, increase the supply and affordability of housing while retaining local decision-making. Number 3, improve public safety in California communities. Number 4, safeguard essential local revenues and support fiscal sustainability. That said, I think the organization's almost singular focus for the next year and a half is going to be defeating the Business Roundtable initiative that we are anticipating will qualify for the November 2024 ballot as early as next month. That would be very detrimental to cities around the state in terms of local control. And then relatedly, and kind of pushing in the opposite direction, we heard from Assemblymember Aguiar Curry, who, as I think most people know, is based in Yolo County, but whose district extends into some fringes of Sonoma County, not here. And she indicated that she's going to be making another run at a bill she ran a couple of years ago, which was Assembly Constitutional Amendment 1, which would, if passed, she needs a 2/3 vote in each house of the legislature and then a majority approval by the voters of the state. But it would reduce the threshold for special local taxes for infrastructure from 2/3 to 55%. And I have to say that with the presentation by our fire chief and police chief at a recent meeting, that really resonated with me as some place we might need to go or will want to go, because even though Measure U is great, it doesn't get us everywhere we need to be. So keep an eye on ACA 1. She tried it before. I think she learned some lessons and is more confident on getting it passed this time. And then this morning, there was a meeting of, an ad hoc meeting of directors of the 3 different groundwater sustainability agencies in Sonoma County and staff to see if there might be opportunities for consolidation in the management of those 3 groundwater basins. And the consensus is there may be some little things we can do in the near term, but probably in terms of an actual consolidation, that's premature, maybe look at it a couple of years down the road. So that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Barnacle.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I've had no appointments. I did want to share a local win on the quick build process. I know we started to get going on that. The city of Emeryville set a goal of installing seating at every bus stop in the city, and they did it in the same year. I thought it was a pretty cool quick build project, just something simple, but makes a difference for some people. And then I'd appreciate some update on the cell tower ordinances that were just raised. And then to the people who brought up the tenant ordinance, I just checked the tentative or the agenda planner for the council, and it is on the agenda for January 9th, I believe. But maybe city manager or the city attorney can confirm that, but that is the plan, I believe.
Thank you. Councilmember Fisher.
I have nothing to report. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will follow up on Councilmember Barnacle's request to get an update on the timing for the tenancy ordinance. So Mayor, City Attorney.
So, the expiration date is clear, Council, and I think what we're going to be planning, what we're starting to plan already, in communication with the council and the community about, is making sure that we are in a position to do the outreach that we need to do and have the stakeholder dialogues that we need to have and have the menu of options before the council and not just a complete integrated package, so that we can address all that. An option that I'd like to avoid, but if we need it to cover all that, an option would be a short extension of the ordinance to make sure that we check all those boxes, but we're hopeful that we can avoid that with our scheduling, but we'll be in touch more about that with the council and the public. But there's stakeholder dialogues we need to have for sure, and also be presenting to the council some choices that come from those and staff recommendations about those regulations going forward.
Okay, thank you for that update. I do think the extensions is a good plan B, but I do think it was the intention of those who voted for this in September for it to be a permanent solution that provided, no gaps. And so I think the key is no gaps and to extend it into permanent status. So however that can be done, I appreciate that since I won't be here. But thank you for that. And we'll turn it over to the city manager for city manager comments.
Thank you, Mayor, and City Council, and Petaluma community. I have no updates tonight, but I do want to address some comments that were made during public comment. When the City Council approved the modifications to our IZO Chapter 24 earlier this year, there was no modifications to review authority with the exception of increasing review of variances in the floodway to the discretion of the Planning Commission. Those modifications approved by the council did not increase staff's discretion. That said, there are different entitlements that are and have been at the discretion of staff for years. Examples of these entitlements are minor use permits and administrative site plan and architectural review. And as outlined in the city's code, there are different wireless facilities that trigger different levels of review, including applications that are reviewed as building permit, administrative use permits, and major use permits. That has not changed. So when a project is reviewed at the staff level as an administrative permit, the project is noticed and specific findings as outlined in the code are required to be made prior to approval. So additionally, all administrative permits can be appealed to the Planning Commission. And then as far as the wireless ordinance, the telecom ordinance, that dropped off the city's priority list because that was replaced by our top 10 list. And I don't know, Eric, I know you had it on your list for a while and.
It's still on my list. We still do need some updates to.
The chapter.
Really to provide for better tools for processing applications and making sure we maximally reserve city decision makers' discretion while complying with the shot clock requirements and all that, those things. And plus, we just need there's some updating that's needed because of changes in the law. So, we're going to be, no doubt, in conversation with the council in the coming year as our timeline estimates for the council priorities evolve, as they're certain to do. And as to how, we do a lot more than 10 things during the year. And so some of these things that are opportunities or things that need addressing have to happen along with the council priorities. So I look forward to strategizing how we can do the major pieces of that and weave them in with the rest of the work that we're doing. So I know that's a little vague, but we still have some good draft work and good background that we can be working on completing the next year.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. And that concludes my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we are on to the consent calendar, and I'd like to ask Assistant City Manager Brian Cochran to provide an oral report on items 5 and item 6.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Good evening, council members. So we have 2 updates for you tonight. The first is on item 5, which is the amended employment agreement with our city clerk, and wanted to report out, so Government Code Section 54953C2, which is part of the Brown Act, does require that prior to taking final action on an employment agreement, the legislative body needs an oral report of a summary of the salary schedule, or the compensation that's paid to the employee in the form of fringe benefits of a local agency executive during the open meeting in which the final action is to be taken. So this oral comment constitutes that report. The key changes this time in the city clerk's agreement, there were just a few. There's an amended salary. The new annual salary is $164,883 annually. On the administrative leave, there's an increase there from 80 hours per fiscal year to 96 hours per fiscal year. And then finally, as we typically do when we bring these amended agreements, we made miscellaneous benefit language cleanups to keep the language modern in terms of truing up current city policies and practices, modifying the holiday schedule, and updating the latest city healthcare contributions. So that concludes the oral report on the item 5 amendment to the city clerk's employment agreement. And then finally, just quickly, item 6, there was a typo that was found on page 3 of that staff report. It referenced an incorrect date. I believe it said January 24th, 2022. It should have said December 19th, 2022. And that was correct everywhere in the staff report as well as on the resolution, except in that one spot on page 3. So we did upload an amended staff report that corrects that typo. That's all I have for you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, I will ask our members of the City Council if there's anyone who would like to pull something or recuse themselves. Councilmember King?
Yes, I will be recusing from item number 6, the Downtown Petaluma Business Improvement District. I have an office within the district, and I pay the assessment. So, as with every other year, I'm recusing.
Okay, and I understand all you need to do is refrain from voting. You don't have to leave the dais.
Okay.
So thank you. Anybody else? Councilmember Healy?
Thank you. I'll be recusing from item 6 for the same reason as Councilmember King. And I'd also like to pull item 5 off the consent calendar. Thank you.
Okay, pull item 5. Thank you. And anybody else? Not seeing anyone. Okay, so I will ask if there's if the clerk has received any public comment on the consent calendar items.
Madam Mayor, no comments on the consent calendar were received prior to the meeting.
Thank you. And I do not have any cards for speakers here in the city council chamber on this item, or these items. And so I will ask our moderator to see if there's anybody in the virtual audience who would like to speak to this item.
During public comment on agenda items, the public is invited to make comments on that particular agenda item that is being presented to the City Council. Members of the public attending online or by phone should raise their virtual hand or press star 9 if participating by phone. And Madam Mayor, no hands are raised.
So with that, we will open and close public comment on the consent calendar items. And I think so I will ask for a motion from the council. Councilmember McDonald.
I'd like to motion the consent calendar with the exceptions of 5 and 6.
Okay, and is there a second? Councilmember Fisher? Okay, so motion by McDonald, second by Fisher, and we'll have a roll call vote.
Barrett,
Yes?
Barnacle,
Yes.
Fisher,
Yes.
Healy,
Yes?
King,
Yes.
McDonald,
Yes.
Posake.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
Okay, so I will, since Councilmember Healy has pulled item 5, I'll ask Councilmember Healy if you'd like to make a comment on that.
Yes, thank you. I do think our city clerk is doing an excellent job. I think virtually all of our city employees are also doing excellent jobs. I cannot support a 22% pay raise for this position, one of our direct reports, when we're not able to offer anything comparable that to our other bargaining units. So I will respectfully be voting no.
Thank you very much. So is there a motion for item number 5?
I'll make that motion.
Okay, Vice Mayor Posake has made the motion, and Councilmember Barnacle?
Second.
Okay, so there's a second by Barnacle, and the motion is by Posake, and we will have a roll call vote.
Barrett,
Yes?
Barnacle,
Yes.
Fisher,
Yes.
Healy,
No.
King,
Yes.
McDonald,
Yes.
Posake.
Yes.
Motion passes 6-1, Healy voting no.
Thank you very much. And now we're on to item number 6, and I will call on Councilmember McDonald.
I motion to approve item number 6.
Okay, and Councilmember Barnacle?
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion and by McDonald and a second by Barnacle. And we have 2 people who are recusing themselves, so we'll have a roll call vote.
Barrett,
Yes.
Barnacle,
Yes.
Fisher,
Yes.
McDonald,
Yes.
Posake.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously with Healy and King recused.
Thank you. And with that, we are on to public hearings and matters for consideration. And this is a public hearing, an introduction of an ordinance approving a zoning text amendment of implementing zoning ordinance Section 11.040, alternatives to on-site parking, and associated references in Section 11.030, off-street parking general regulations, and Section 11.065, power of the zoning administrator director to modify requirements, and finding that this action is exempt from CEQA pursuant to CEQA guidelines sections 15305 and 15601B3. So with that, I will ask our staff member, Andrew Triple, to make the presentation.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Great. Hello, good evening, members of council. My name is Andrew Triple. I'm the planning manager here at the city of Petaluma. And I'll be presenting this evening's zoning text amendment. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And I can confirm that I believe we're sharing it in my council chambers. So I'll proceed. So this is a zoning text amendment to ICO section 11.040 and associated references. Public hearing and introduction of the ordinance first reading. A bit of background on how this zoning text amendment has come forward. It is a property owner initiated zoning text amendment, which recently, I believe, the majority of our amendments have been city initiated. So I did want to make that point. Recently, the property owner at the Hampton Inn Petaluma, which was the adaptive reuse of the historic silk mill converted into the Hampton Inn, proposed an expansion project to increase the room count from 75 rooms to 93 rooms.
Hey, Andrew, can I stop you for a second? I'm getting feedback that.
Do you want plugged in or no? Okay, how's that? Oh, much better. Great. And so the increase of rooms from 75 to 93 would be an 18-room increase in a completely separate building from the silk mill, so there was no expansion of the historic structure. As part of that project, the applicant requested a 19% reduction in required parking for the expanded 93-room facility from what would be required to be 94 spaces to utilize the existing 77 spaces that were currently part of the facility. Planning staff informed him that a variance would be required for this request and that staff would not be able to make the findings to recommend approval of a variance. But another option was to submit a zoning text amendment application for a citywide amendment to modify the minimum parking requirements through a discretionary process. And so the applicant, Perry Patel, did submit that zoning text application or zoning text amendment application. There was a Planning Commission public hearing for discretionary review of the text amendment and recommendation to council, as well as HCPC completed a review of the major historic site plan and architectural review application during a public hearing for discretionary review of that item. Those public hearings were held on November 15, 2022. We did that in a joint meeting of the Planning Commission and HCPC. During that meeting, Planning Commission reviewed the zoning text amendment only because that was their purview for that portion of the project. And by a vote of 7-0, recommended adoption of the zoning text amendment to council, subject to 2 modifications, which I will review. Then subsequently, HCPC then reviewed the project-specific entitlement, Major H-SPAR, and by a vote of 5-0, approved project-specific CEQA exemptions, as well as conditionally approved the 19% reduction in required parking and the H-SPAR request for review, subject to adoption of this ordinance. So with regard to the citywide zoning text amendments are governed by Chapter 25 of the Implementing Zoning Ordinance and by California Government Code Section 65853. The Implementing Zoning Ordinance provides that Planning Commission may recommend zoning text amendments for approval to City Council based on findings that the proposed amendments are in conformance with the city's general plan and consistent with the public necessity, convenience, and general welfare. So to take a step back and give this a bit of context, we have local, regional, and statewide context to consider. In the spring of 2019, the City Council declared a climate emergency to address the adverse effects of climate change and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it adopted an aggressive goal of achieving carbon neutrality by the year 2030 via the subsequently adopted Climate Emergency Framework and corresponding Climate Ready 2030 initiative. In doing so, the framework recognizes that one of the city's largest and increasing contributors to greenhouse gas emissions is transportation from gas-powered vehicles. Additionally, 2 goals of the city's 2025 general plan seek to minimize the contribution of greenhouse gases from new construction and to expand and improve transit and shared mobility services to be more accessible and attractive than single occupancy vehicle use. Continuing on, carbon neutrality continues to be one of the city's highest ranked goals. And in order to achieve carbon neutrality, we must continue to reduce our dependence on automobiles, in part by disincentivizing single occupancy vehicle use. and encouraging modal shift to alternative transportation modes and alternative transportation programs. Additionally, in 2022, following a joint study session with Planning Commission and PBAC, City Council directed planning staff to explore changes to local regulations, including eliminating parking minimums, establishing parking maximums, and increasing requirements that facilitate active transportation choices. This work is ongoing, and this amendment would not replace that effort. At the regional level, we find that a variety of municipalities, both large and small, have moved to either eliminate minimum parking requirements in their entirety in all or part of their municipalities. And this includes Santa Rosa, Healdsburg, San Jose, Alameda, Emeryville, and several others. Additionally, at the state level, various mandates since 2015 reform parking by reducing or eliminating parking requirements based on locational factors or land use factors. The most recent being AB 2097, which the governor signed at the end of September this year, which would eliminate the minimum parking requirement for any land use within half a mile of a high-quality transit facility, with the exception of hotels. So with that in mind, that context, then we take a quick look at the current policy to see how it addresses minimum parking requirements. Those requirements are established in Table 11.1, and Section 11.040 provides for allowed alternatives to achieving the required minimum parking. This includes off-site parking, parking in a shared common facility, valet parking, or the implementation of a parking district, such as our downtown parking assessment district. However, what's important to recognize is that these alternatives don't allow for a reduction in the minimum amount of required parking. They only allow you to find parking at alternative locations or through alternative sources. Then Section 11.065 provides zoning administrator approval for three types of modifications to minimum required parking. The first is to utilize compact parking spaces to achieve the minimum requirement, hence no reduction in the number of spaces required. It does provide for a reduction in the number of spaces in the case of elderly or retirement home land uses, which would be a land use-based reduction, and then a reduction if the use has available a common parking facility. And this reduction is subject to limitations as well as conditional use permit approval. So this example is a locational reduction with a discretionary entitlement required. So then on to the proposed text amendments. The proposed amendment would include the addition of Section 11.040D as the amendment, and it would set forth two types of adjustments to the minimum amount of required parking. The first would be a minor adjustment, and a minor adjustment would be allowed when it's a request for a reduction in parking of 20% or less. It may be approved at the discretion of the director or of the review authority for associated project entitlements, if it is determined that the reduction is consistent with certain findings. And then the next level is a major adjustment, and that would be in response to a request for a parking reduction of greater than 20%. That may be granted through a conditional use permit reviewed by Planning Commission, and again, Planning Commission would have to determine that the reduction is consistent with certain findings. I want to go back here and just identify a couple of things. Even the director level approval would still be a discretionary approval, and that has been a topic of conversation at a couple of levels this evening. A discretionary approval by the director is because the director would be required to make certain findings. So anytime we're required to make certain findings, that does become a discretionary process. Second, the process of minor adjustment and major adjustment is relatively consistent with our current process of considering variances. So previously, as I noted when I was introducing the Hampton Inn expansion project, prior to this amendment, the only way the applicant would have to reduce the amount of required parking would be through a variance process. And it's challenging to make the findings to recommend approval of a variance if you don't have physical constraints to the site. And so variances are required to be heard by the director, and the director has the ability to refer a variance to the Planning Commission. So this is actually sensitive to the variance process and in part reflects it, except that it does direct that any request for a reduction greater than 20% go to the Planning Commission, absent the direction of the director. So in terms of required findings, which are very important and have been crafted very carefully, the first is that the applicant has to submit a parking demand analysis, for a minor adjustment or a parking demand study for a major adjustment, demonstrating that the parking demand for that project is different from the standards specified in Table 11.1. So we wanted to differentiate between the parking demand analysis and a parking demand study primarily due to cost. A parking demand study is prepared by a professional engineer, and that cost could oftentimes exceed $5,000 or more to prepare a parking demand study. And so to be sensitive to that cost for minor projects that may be requesting a parking reduction of less than 20%, we have the option of a parking demand analysis. They would still have to provide the same information. The difference would be in the level of the professional preparing the analysis or study. Then the next finding would be that the number of parking spaces approved, excluding on-street parking spaces, will be sufficient for the safe, convenient, and efficient operation of the use. And this second finding reflects the preference of Planning Commission, who asked that the language excluding on-street parking spaces be added to the proposed amendment to recognize that existing land uses may have needs for on-street parking, and that should not be included as a factor in reducing parking spaces. And then third, the overall project characteristics, including location, access to alternative transportation modes, and incorporation of alternative transportation programs, as well as support for reduced on-site parking and associated city goals, policies, and initiatives related to climate action, enhanced connectivity, economic vitality, and community character. So these are quite robust findings that would be required to be made through a discretionary process. I want to take a quick step back and note that the difference between the minor adjustment and major adjustment of 20% was additionally a request by Planning Commission to reduce that threshold. Planning staff had initially recommended a threshold of 25%, and the Commission was more comfortable reducing that to 20%. So then we find that the essential characteristics of the proposed parking reduction policy are that it's demand sensitive. And so through the analysis or the study, we're looking at the demand for parking for a project, a specific project, rather than making assumptions about that project and basing that calculation of assumed demand on general characteristics. And then next, it's sensitive to project-specific characteristics such as location, proximity to transit, including smart train as well as public transit by bus, as well as walkability and bicycle infrastructure. And then the land use itself, the nature of the land use and how it may differentiate from what would be expected of the land use. And then finally, alternative transportation modes or programs that the particular project may employ. And then next, it's responsive to the scale of the request, as I indicated, the minor adjustment being less than 20% and the major being greater than 20%. And finally, it is discretionary. Required findings must be made. Public noticing and review of a majority of the requests would be completed, and then the decision is appealable to Planning Commission or to City Council. Then for associated references that would need to be modified should the amendment be adopted, we would request modification to section 11.030C to just add reference to modifications by section 11.040, and then to add to section 11.065 that when a request for a reduction has been approved, no further action would be needed. So standards for review include consistency with the general plan, alignments with goals and policies of the plan, as well as noting that the amendment does not change the general character of current zoning regulations and it would continue to regulate parking. And then in the implementing zoning ordinance that it's consistent with public convenience, necessity, and welfare. So we found alignment with or implementation of a wide variety of goals and policies, 31 of them in fact. With regard to land development to meet long-term community needs, we find that it would support mixed-use development, flexible building form, intensification of development along corridors and at underutilized sites, and it would help applicants innovate in site and building design. It would protect and enhance the identity and connectivity throughout our community by encouraging adaptive reuse, rehabilitation, and infill development at preferred locations, as well as support development and planning for 15-minute neighborhoods. Finally, it would support goals and policies related to air quality improvement and transportation needs. It could reduce vehicle usage, promote ride sharing and car sharing programs, and encourage modal shift. And finally, it would increase economic vitality and opportunity, could help to expand existing retail and employment centers, support economic development and investment, and encourage those retail and services to support higher residential densities. Yeah. Sure. The finding for public necessity, convenience, and welfare. Zoning text amendments are consistent with the public necessity, convenience, and welfare in that the amendment will provide greater flexibility to reduce vehicle-related air pollution, increase utilization of non-vehicular transportation modes, and reduce auto-dependent design. It would allow for a new review process that creates greater flexibility in achieving parking compliance for a variety of land uses, and it would ensure that the reviewing bodies, such as the Planning Commission, can respond to project-specific characteristics that would reduce demand for parking. Public comments were received both at the Planning Commission public hearing as well as in advance of this evening's public hearing. For the Planning Commission public hearing, both written and oral comment by the same commenter expressed concerns that the Hampton Inn project needs more parking and not less. Similar concerns were expressed in advance of this public hearing, that the parking reductions would support new development and not existing property owners, or that the required parking demand analyses may not be viewed as legitimate if provided by the applicant. Planning staff would like to respond by saying that both quantitative and qualitative data are required to support the findings through preparation of a parking demand analysis or study. Typically, those are prepared by a licensed professional engineer. And second, Planning Commission requested that the modification be added to exclude on-street parking from consideration, and this does reflect a sensitivity and respect for existing land uses, in particular residential. Another concern expressed by the public was the perception that the amendment proposes a ministerial process and no opportunity for higher review by Planning Commission. The process in and of itself is a discretionary proposal in that required findings are needed to be made. And also the director, should the director, through the administrative process, feel that it's necessary to elevate to HCPC or to Planning Commission, they would be able to do that. So it doesn't take away any authority of the director to elevate. And then next, the perception that the public does not have the opportunity to review or comment about the process. Of course, with a public hearing, this wouldn't be an issue because we notice public hearings and we hold them in a public meeting format. But for administrative decisions which would be publicly noticed but not held in a public meeting format, it is true that the public would not have the opportunity to input other than provide comments to the project planner. So we would do the same noticing as we do for any discretionary review. And then, of course, all decisions could be appealed to a higher review authority should the public disagree with the decision that's made. And so with regard to CEQA, planning staff determined that the ordinance is exempt from CEQA based on the following. CEQA guidelines, section 15061B3. In that, CEQA applies only to projects that have the potential for causing a significant effect on the environment. Additionally, it's not a project in that it's an administrative activity with no potential for resulting in physical change to the environment, and that any subsequent discretionary review would be subject to CEQA. And the second exemption is CEQA guidelines, section 15305, minor alteration to land use exemptions. And additionally, any application of the ordinance on future projects, as I mentioned, would require analysis pursuant to CEQA. And so with that, Planning Division recommends that City Council adopt the zoning text amendment resolution modifying section 11.040 of the implementing zoning ordinance to add a process for minimum parking adjustments to minimum parking requirements subject to certain findings and review authority approval, as well as to adopt modifications to associated references in section 11.030 and 11.065 to clarify and implement these changes. And then also to find that the action is exempt from CEQA pursuant to CEQA guidelines, section 15305 and 15601B3. And with that, that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll go to questions from council members, starting with Councilmember Fisher.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor. Angie, would you review once again the difference between a parking demand analysis and a parking demand study? Because you just said that either one would probably be done by a professional. So I'm not understanding the difference between them, and do we have definitions for what's required for each of those? And what are the differences, I guess?
Sure. So the primary difference would be that, a parking demand study could be done by a civil engineer who may not necessarily do a parking demand study. Or a parking demand analysis, rather, could be done by a civil engineer who may not necessarily do a parking demand study. We would require that a parking demand study be prepared by a transportation engineer who is licensed and would do that. A parking demand analysis we would anticipate be prepared by a design professional or a land use professional, but not specifically a transportation engineer.
So what is the difference between an analysis and a study?
There would really be no substantial difference. They could both consider the same factors: location, land use, project characteristics, alternative transportation modes. It's really just raising the level of the study to the individual who prepares it.
Okay. Councilmember Healy.
Thank you. So on public noticing, you said that a majority of these requests would be subject to public noticing. Why not just say all? People are suspicious.
Sure, and that is a recommendation that we're prepared to make to council, is that we would add a public noticing requirement that any minor or major adjustment be noticed consistent with section 24.100.
Okay, thank you. And continuing on the same subject, does public noticing consist of posting large signs on the project site, or sending letters to people within a certain radius, and or legal notice in the newspaper, all of the above?
No, we have two different levels of public noticing depending upon the level of discretionary review. So administrative review, we mail notice to property owners within 500 feet, and we publish in the Argus Courier. But for a public hearing, or for what would be a major adjustment, then that would receive the on-site noticing, the mailed noticing, and the published noticing.
I guess, I think people kind of expect to see the big blue signs now, and that's been a major improvement in our previous practices. And I'm leaning towards saying that those should be required here as well. So anyway, that's my thinking.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Vice Mayor Postlequet.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I had a question regarding also about the parking demand analysis and study, I guess, sort of in that there's a comment in the report that suburban hotels I think it's in the US on average, have an average occupancy of 66%. It seemed like that number for this hotel would have been easy to obtain. I'm wondering why that wasn't in here as well or instead.
So, well, that's a great question. Thank you. And I think that points to how when we make those general assumptions to establish minimum parking requirements, sometimes even at the industry level, those assumptions miss a key point. Exact factor, occupancy rate, was one of the factors that drove the applicant to request the reduction in parking. Naturally, I think any hotel owner would be excited to achieve a 100% occupancy rate, which would then result in a minimum of, one car per room, especially in a suburban hotel. But when you have hotels downtown, and in particular in this case, that brought forward the zoning text amendment being adjacent to the SMART station just down the street from it, as well as in close proximity to downtown, those locational factors combine with the land use factors to reduce parking demand. So I think I'm not quite getting at your
Yeah, well, I guess I was just thinking
Sure.
that, they probably did have a lower than 66% occupancy, and that would strengthen their case to lower the parking. But I suppose you've introduced me to the other aspect of this, is they may not want to advertise that their occupancy has only been 32% or something like that.
There is that. I realized just now that we did not include the parking demand study that was submitted for the Hampton Inn Hotel expansion project. We didn't do that because this is a citywide zoning text amendment as opposed to project specific, so we didn't want to confuse matters. However, I believe it would have been helpful to have shared the parking demand study to see first how it's constructed, but then secondly, it does address occupancy rates for the hotel industry and utilizes data and analysis to conclude that it's quite difficult to achieve, I believe, anything over 80%.
Sure. Okay, thank you. That's good.
Thank you.
Councilmember McDonald?
Thank you. I think some of that came up at the Planning Commission review on this, and I was quite favorable for it and voted for it. But there were certain things that still hung me up about this. One is that the 20%, we pushed down to 20%, and 20% of 10 units is very different than 20% of 1,000 units. So minor at 20% at 1,000, that's not the same. But it still felt like the right place to leave it for staff. And then I think they did submit a parking analysis, and they were and quite happy to share that they had an occupancy of 67 or whatever it was, which means that sometimes it's 100 and sometimes it's 32. And but they proved that their study showed they didn't need the parking, which then caused me to think, well, then is there a climate benefit if they can prove they never needed it? And I believe the way it came out of planning, and correct me if I'm wrong, but even if you knock the higher number down, the 100% down to disincentivize some away from the 100%, you're achieving something. Is that the way you recall that?
Yes, sir.
I mean, just trying to prove that even though they proved they didn't need it, it's still a climate benefit because it's impact on peak occupancy. And then this applies to remodel projects as well, and expansion projects as well as new. And the remodels could provide their own evidence of on-site instead of industry standard, and that would show up in the analysis or traffic studies. So that's one distinction between projects, and that came up, right?
Correct. Yes, it did.
And then I think we also talked about that we're in the midst of general plan update, and having the IZO change now helps, but we'll get another bite at the apple in 2 years.
Right.
So we felt confident in that.
That's correct. We were very conscious of where we are with the direction to review our parking standards. And of course, the study that commenced this summer to begin that analysis. And we felt that this was still appropriate. Perhaps an elimination of parking minimums might be, say, to expand the downtown parking assessment district and may not be applicable throughout the city. Whereas to take this approach to create this sort of parking reduction policy tool would be applicable for all land uses throughout the city and would then give review authorities maximum flexibility to respond to innovation and to project-specific characteristics.
Great, thank you.
I would also, if I could, point out, Councilmember McDonald, that as you saw happen at the Planning Commission public hearing, even though it was a request for a 19% reduction in parking, it was still reviewed by HCPC as part of a major HSPAR application. So when we start to think about, as you mentioned, 20% being 10 spaces versus 100 spaces or something, you know, sort of the magnitude of the reduction, I would offer that it's likely that a larger a request for reduction that results in a larger number of spaces is also going to be part of a larger project that's being reviewed by Planning Commission, by HCPC, or even coming to City Council for general plan amendment or rezoning. So,
Councilmember Barnacle.
Thank you. Just really one question. There's one mention of economic vitality in the what's required for the required findings. I'm just wondering why we're not looking more at that as a required finding, or to what degree are you looking at that, or would it be looked at?
Sure. Well, to look at economic vitality would be to look to the general plan and all of its policies and goals related to economic vitality. So even though we just have one mention of it in the finding C, it directs to look across all of the city's goals and policies that would support economic vitality and revitalization.
So I'd like to finish this up with a question about, there was a mention of neighborhood permit parking to address the impact that it might have on local neighborhoods that are located near hotels. And I wanted you to kind of run through how that might work.
The city does offer a neighborhood permit parking program. I believe it's not heavily utilized, but it is available. And so what a neighborhood can do is petition to have that program established, to establish the boundaries and then to set up the process for obtaining a permit from the city. I believe those are annual permits. And then the Petaluma Police Department is then the enforcement agency for that program.
Okay, so that's good. But then, so if a neighborhood wants to do that, how do they do that? Block by block? How is the neighborhood defined? You know, these are new programs, so it's not like there's already an existing neighborhood that can say, oh, we're the people who would be the permit affected by this.
Sure. Well, I think that some neighborhoods are well defined and named through time, and they have neighborhood associations. I think if it was a new neighborhood that felt that it needed to organize in order to benefit from a permit parking program, they could either self-organize or come to planning division, and we would be happy to help them.
Okay, well, I'm going to disagree with you about that because there's an existing neighborhood called the Oak Hill Brewster neighborhood, but it's much larger than the group that would be impacted by the parking that happens at the Hotel Petaluma. So, which never has had parking. So, I mean, that's already an existing condition there. So if let's just use that as an example. If that neighborhood wanted to get permits required for an existing hotel in an existing condition, it wouldn't be the entire Oak Hill Brewster neighborhood, because that's just too large an area. So how would a smaller group do that? How would they know what other blocks are? They know, like, my block is affected, but how about the block 2 down or 2 over? Well, I don't know how one finds that out. How's that determined?
Well, that is a great question. I'm not sure I have the answer. I think during the planning review process, we could look at a 1/4 mile distance, which would be an average walk distance.
Okay, that's a good metric.
So, right, so we could look at that. You might look at other factors that look at is it major streets or minor streets? A majority of the streets in Oak Hill Brewster are minor streets, and there's a fairly high density. It's almost exclusively residential use, and that's what Planning Commission expressed, was that they wanted to protect residents to ensure that they had the on-street parking available to them. So, while if there was a commercial use along Petaluma Boulevard North, you might not protect the other commercial uses, but you might go beyond them into the residential portions and want to protect a couple of streets in.
Well, and the Silk Mill Hotel is a perfect example of a very commercial area and a very residential area.
Right.
So,
Correct.
so I guess I'm just saying that while that sounded like a good fix, it's really nebulous. And so how that gets defined and put into play is really important. And that probably is a decision that should have public input and happen at a planning commission meeting.
And it occurs to me that we could add that to the parking study that's being done. The work that's being done is directed by council. We could have that as another layer of reviewing those permit parking programs and enhancing them and ensuring that they're clear and accessible.
Okay, well, if someone makes a motion to that, maybe they will add that to that. So I'm going to call on Councilmember Fisher and then Councilmember Healy.
I just wanted to offer that Heather Hines has her hand up.
Oh, I can't see that, so I rely on the moderator for that. I don't see that, so thank you for that. I'll call on Councilmember Healy, and then we'll go to Heather Hines. Okay, all right. Mike wants to hear what you have to say, Heather, before he asks his question.
Thank you, Mayor Barrett. Good evening, council members. I was pulling up in the background the residential parking permit regulations that we do have adopted in our code, and they are very general. There is not a specific way of establishing those districts, and it is something that is required to come to council. So it is something that I think on a case-by-case basis, depending on what the impact is, it's specific to residential, but we could work with neighborhoods if that was the desired direction to go to create permanent parking areas.
And you're calling this program parking areas?
No, I'm just that we do have in our existing municipal code a process to establish residential permit parking. So if there was a neighborhood that was particularly, and we brought up Oak Hill Brewster neighborhood and the Hotel Petaluma, there are ways to create those permit parking to alleviate the impacts of surrounding commercial on residential. Surrounding residential, and it doesn't say there's any one way to define what that residential is. So it could really be designed on a case-by-case basis if that was determined necessary for those neighborhoods.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we'll go back to Councilmember Healy.
Thank you. So I do believe the one residential neighborhood that does have the permits requirement at this point is directly across the street from the junior college campus, and it's been there for many years, and I think it's been a success. In the mayor's and my neighborhood, the Hotel Petaluma is inside the boundaries of the old Keller Street Garage Assessment District, therefore they're not required to provide any on-site parking, and they don't. And then they just tell their patrons and staff to park in the neighborhood. They don't park in the garage. So that's a challenge. But, the other thing, and the Hotel Weaver, and we've gotten some comment letters on that, is outside the boundaries of the Keller Street Garage Assessment District. So they are going to have to provide on-site parking one way or another if that moves forward. But the other one that is interestingly inside the boundaries is the old Carruthers building, now being converted into the headquarters of Amy's. And even though, technically, if you just read our documents, they don't have to provide any on-site parking at all. Nevertheless, the city is working with them because of the major intensification of the use there to have different programs in place that they don't overwhelm the downtown parking. And I think that might be a precedent that we should pursue within the boundaries of the Keller Street Garage Assessment District, that if there's a significant intensification of use at an existing site, that we do what we did with Amy's and require that they, come up with programs to mitigate the parking impacts in the area. Because I'm just concerned that if you have these accumulation of intensified uses, that it's just going to overwhelm the parking situation downtown. If you're in downtown on a weekend evening or afternoon at this point, you'll notice the Golden Eagle Parking Center parking lot is completely full, and I'll bet no more than 5% of those people are patronizing businesses in the Golden Eagle. It's kind of our spillover municipal parking lot, and we, as a city, we want that parking lot to go away and do more high-end stuff on more intense use on the site, but that's going to be a challenge for us. So anyway, you kind of opened a can of worms with this. I'm glad with what you brought forward tonight. I do think the public noticing should be strengthened in the ways we discussed, but other than that, I'm fine.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we're done with council questions. So I will ask the city clerk if she's received any comments prior to the meeting.
Madam Mayor, yes, we received 4 public comments prior to the meeting, which are posted online with the agenda packet.
Okay, thank you. And we have no one in the city hall who wants to speak to this item. So in opening the public hearing on this item, I will ask our city moderator if she has anybody in the virtual audience who would like to speak on this item.
At this time, members of Sorry. At this time, members of the public attending online or by phone should raise their virtual hand or press star 9 if participating by phone. And Madam Mayor, we do have 2 members in the virtual audience.
Thank you. Why don't you go ahead and call on them?
Darren Recusin, I will allow you to speak. You can unmute yourself and address the council.
Thank you for that. And I want to thank Andrew and the Planning Department for incorporating the Planning Commission's feedback on this text amendment. The one big thing that came up in that meeting was also establishing some kind of feedback mechanism and assessment of cumulative impacts and I think it was determined that this should really be administrative guidance for staff when they are deciding on a major or minor adjustment. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, Planning Manager Triple, but I believe this would be some form of map that would show in an area how many major and minor adjustments were made. And that could be part of the decision-making process to make sure we don't have, 10 major adjustments in a neighborhood. I don't know what neighborhood that would be. I can't imagine. But anyway, just this idea of having some kind of feedback mechanism, assessment of cumulative impacts that wasn't too onerous in terms of data collection. You could go all the way to being subjective and interviewing residents of surrounding areas if they felt that the adjustments were, somehow creating too much overflow and affecting their ability. That might be too onerous, but at least having a map so staff could see where these adjustments were made and having that be part of the decision making. And I just stepped away and came back. So if that's already been discussed, my apologies, but I would love to see that included, kind of baked into the administrative guidance of the application of this text amendment when staff is making required findings. Thank you.
And John Shribs, I'm going to allow you to speak. You should be able to unmute yourself and address the council.
Thank you. This is John Shribs, and I'd like having the council members start asking more specifics about concrete examples. I always like to hear concrete examples of how this is being used. This example of the hotel that's being used now is very good, and looks like it's a worthwhile project, what they need to meet there. But how else is it going to be used, both positively and negatively in the future, and by whom? For example, if it's for the Rounded Transportation Corps that we have at the train station, we have new properties and developments. Will this allow less parking to be done in the future than what is being required, what we required now? So it might be a benefit to different type of structures that we would use and parking requirements. Over at the Target Center, since there's an abundance of parking there, it's spaces that maybe we would like to convert over to some other use. Would this be regulation that's being put forth help that transition to move forward, or at least open it up to make it easier to transition parking lots in shopping centers and the like to be converted into other structures, building structures and the like? And how could it be used downtown by smaller business folks that want to expand out? Oh, I'd like to put up a more permanent benches for my restaurant and take up some spaces in the small little parking lot I have. To do that, will that be passed through and more easily now that we have this rule in place? So how's it going to be used and by whom? More examples I'd like to hear about coming from, especially from the business folks downtown. And then once we do the parking and do these restrictions and include all these climate change actions, is there a way of including that when you do this, you must provide electric car charging stations as part of your package. You must provide more bicycle parking and with a camera, security cameras in place, so there's no thefts of the more expensive bicycles that are being used now. So can we add in there not just our parking spaces, but be more inclusive, include electric cars, charging, and bicycle parking as part of the requirements when this does go into action? You do reduce the parking in any which way. So it's just a little larger consideration, maybe broaden things out a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that the last speaker?
Yes, that was the last public comment.
Okay, we're going to close close the public hearing, but I would like to see if our program manager wanted to address that last question, but I know you needed. Yes, okay. Thank you.
Sure. And I did want to address Mr. Rakuson's comment about as staff administratively monitoring implementation of the program. And he is correct. We did agree during the Planning Commission public hearing that staff would be able to collect those data and map them, and that would be a basic sort of level of monitoring that we could do and would be able to implement and maintain. So that when we do receive a request for parking reduction, we could look and see what other reductions may have been approved in the area and sort of monitor that cumulative impact that may happen should there be a tremendous amount of activity in a certain area. So that's no problem. With regard to Mr. Shrib's comments, if redevelopment, so a likely scenario would be redevelopment of a shopping center to either perhaps add some residential to it in a mixed-use format or expand its retail square footage. And through that redevelopment process, they could request a parking reduction. They would have to demonstrate, though, that the parking provided is sufficient for all of the square footage of all of the uses on the site. So they couldn't narrowly analyze just how it might affect or how the proposed new use might differentiate in project characteristics. They would have to review the entire site that would be impacted by the proposed reduction. So I think that would be a standard practice and would be something that we would typically expect as part of planning review. And then how can it be used and by who? It's a citywide proposal. And so at this point in time, any land use throughout the city could take advantage of a request for parking reduction. And then finally, it certainly would be within the purview of the review authority in making findings to request additional bicycle parking be installed or electric vehicle charging stations. So that is one of the, I think, benefits of the discretionary review process, is that we can drive and pursue other policies through the review process that we may want to implement.
Thank you very much. And I briefly saw Heather Hines had her hand up. I don't know if she continues to speak.
Well, I might be touching on the same thing Eric's about to touch on, but I'll start it, and Eric, we can tag team a little bit. So I wanted to circle back to the issue of the noticing. So the way our noticing currently is adopted into the code is there's one set of noticing requirements for all of the administrative projects. So this is the administrative site plan and architectural review, the minor use permits, the administrative historic and cultural preservation, or minor administrative historic SPAR. And that is publishing in the Argus Courier, sending notices within a 500-foot radius. Major projects, so those are the ones that go to the Planning Commission, a major CUP, a major site plan and architectural review, a subdivision, a rezone, anything that's going to a public hearing has a different set of noticing requirements. And that's mailed notices to 1,000 feet, publication in the Argus, and posting of the on-site sign. So we don't require the sign for administrative permits. And a lot of that was based on costs and timing of that addition. So when we talk about adding that for these parking reductions, the way it's currently set up is if it would be a minor reduction, it would be part of administrative and noticed that way. And if it was a major reduction going to Planning Commission or part of a major project, it would be noticed going to Planning Commission. So I just wanted to kind of clarify those two differences in our code currently.
Thank you for that clarification. And City Attorney?
I don't really have anything to add. I was going to raise the same thing, that the issue of noticing is one that we probably is best looked at holistically because it affects other types of applications, not just the ones that are being considered tonight. And if there are questions of the council, I can work with Heather to address them. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Councilmember Healy.
So I had another question. So you got the study, you got the analysis, you make a decision, Planning Commission makes a decision, council makes a decision, wherever, and then they're off and running. Is there ever any look back 2 years, 5 years down the road to see if the right decision was made? And I have in mind another decision, another situation about a block from the Hotel Petaluma, since that came up, and that's Brewster's, where they're outside the boundaries of the assessment district for the Keller Street Garage. And there was a lot of time and energy that went into determining how much off-street parking they needed to require. And just from my perspective of someone who lives a block and a half away, I have to say they do very good business. And there are a lot of peak times when I don't think they have adequate off-street parking because everything is just done. And so is there any true up in this process that you make a practice of going back 2 years later, 4 years later and saying, yeah, this worked, no, this didn't work, and if it didn't work, what should be done to bring it back into the kind of compliance we were expecting?
Sure, that's a great question, and I think a great example. One of the benefits of bringing this amendment forward at this point in time is because of the ongoing work to evaluate all parking throughout the city. And while I don't know that, as it would be typical to review policy implementation through sort of a policy approach, probably less so through a development review process. But I think certainly we could build into the parking study that sort of long-term monitoring and review, because a lot of the decisions coming out of that work, I think, would want to be monitored and be evaluated for success.
Is there any kind of formal monitoring process in place now?
No, there's not. There's not, and the proposed amendment doesn't include that.
No, right, okay, I get that, but.
The only monitoring we would do is in response to planning commission's request that we map all of the approvals and monitor them that way, so that when we do get a new application in, we could go and look at where we've approved previously and sort of be very conscious of potential for overconcentration, should there be that level of activity.
I just think there should be some mechanism if a neighborhood or staff thinks that something is not performing the way it was presented, that it can be revisited.
If I could, Council, I don't think there's a mechanism right now, except for the fact that we're in the midst of our general plan update, which is going to be followed by wholesale implementing zoning to implement that. And so I think, as we've talked about in regard to some of these other sometimes significant policy changes we're doing now, I view it as a little bit of an experimentation time as we're pivoting to address climate change and some of the other things we are, housing, that we're going to get to look at again when we do the general plan process. Now, the caveat for that is once there's what we call AVCO vesting, which is hard costs under a permit incurred by the applicant on the ground, there's vesting. So it's not like we can just, even in the later general plan process, go back and say, okay, you need 12 more spaces or whatever. But we can certainly revisit the policies and also the mechanisms by which we deal with these things, because I think still these parking reduction objectives as part of GHG reduction and climate change response are relatively new, and I think I'm sure we have some things to figure out still to strike the balances correctly, but the general plan process, I think, will be a help to us to be able to look at some things holistically and revisit some of these questions.
So if what you're saying is, I appreciate that, if what you're saying is that once permission is granted for a certain level of parking, we can never revisit that, then that kind of, to me, means maybe we should err on the side of being more conservative in the assumptions and the studies that are being presented, as opposed to just kind of down the middle. I don't know. I don't know if there's a way around that.
You guys dropped it, didn't you? Well, there are going to be competing interests, as there so often as the council is almost always weighing in on, and it'll be important whether as staff has rightly said, discretionary processes are not ministerial processes, and that means there's weighing that happens of these competing interests, whether by staff or by another body or on appeal before another body. So those are going to be important considerations, and that's why it's good that the process would be discretionary, because that can be weighed, and when there's at a minimum, even I think the recommendation by staff is even at a minimum for the administrative determinations, they're still going to be noticed. That's right? So there will be a chance for competing views to be brought forward, and I know staff are going to be looking at them anyway, even if that doesn't occur.
Okay, thank you. And then going back to the noticing thing, so I understand the distinction that Ms. Hines was making. Can we still say that all of these requests would be publicly noticed one way or the other?
Yes,
that is opposed to the majority.
So if they're not already noticed, I would anticipate that a lot of the requests are going to come as part of another discretionary entitlement application, whether it's SPAR or CUP. Mm-hmm. So we would anticipate that a majority of them will already be noticed. But by adding that language in to require noticing of any decision to approve a parking reduction, then we would capture those few that may come forward but not otherwise require discretionary.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. Councilmember Barnacle.
Thank you for the staff report and all of the explanation and discussion. I think this really just sort of demonstrates the tipping point where we're at for me, because we absolutely want to be intensifying uses. I long for the day when we're at 100% parking occupancy, because that probably means that our businesses are thriving. I just think we need to be looking. I appreciate what Councilmember-elect Shribs mentioned about bike parking and just thinking about TDM. I think EV charging is a great and kind of a no-brainer, and probably any hotel is going to need it. But micro-mobility solutions coming from a hotel that's that close to downtown. I mean, if we really want to try and shave trips, it's like the ideal location. But if it's not safe for people to get downtown from there, they're going to drive, and then they're going to be taking their traffic right down D Street and creating more congestion. So if we want to be, really thinking about where we need to go, this is just, to me more, like we can't put our feet in both sides of the fence here. We need to go all in on something. I think everybody knows where I stand on this stuff, but absolutely in support of this. Honestly, I wish we would make it simpler and get rid of parking minimums. We had 6 out of 7 council members say that they supported getting rid of parking minimums. So I'm not sure why we're here with multiple phases and tiers of that when we had like clear direction from the council saying to just go with parking minimums. And maybe that's a question of why did we give clear direction and it come back with this sort of like tiered approach?
Well, if I could respond to that. So I think that the clear direction is still being worked on. We're still in the process of developing that approach, and there will be more policy coming forward with that regard. This amendment came forward as a property owner initiated amendment. And so we are responding to that application for a zoning text amendment and creating this parking reduction policy in response to that. So while it's a citywide zoning text amendment, because it couldn't be project specific, we are responding to that application, while the parking study and work that council has requested is continuing to move forward.
I hear that, and I also just the dueling factions I think on the council are pretty clear right now. I just feel like in terms of staff time and optimizing the use of staff time and getting things done, like if we're going to move forward on something to just rip the Band-Aid off and get it done, I feel like we're kind of taking a half a step forward instead of a full step forward. And so that to me is what's most frustrating about this, is that we're not really fully putting ourselves through it. There's a lot of what ifs, how could this be used, and things like that. And those are all right questions to ask. But for me, the real questions are, how do we be ready to roll out permit programs in a more meaningful way? How do we be ready to offset vehicle trips and congestion from, when intensities really, or when uses really do get intensified? Like, those are the questions that we need to be answering. And right now we're sort of waffling between 20% or 25%, how much is going to be super saturated, these sorts of like unanswerable questions that sort of lead us to fear and conservatism when we know where we need to be going and we've given direction that that's where we want to be going. So I'm going to support this, but it feels like a bit of wasted time, to be quite honest, that we're here not approving an elimination of parking minimums instead of what we're here talking about tonight. So that's my comment, and with that, I'll move the item.
Okay, we have a motion from Councilmember Barnacle, but I'm going to go on to Councilmember Fisher.
I'll go ahead and second the motion. And I have two questions in terms of granting approval for either a minor or a major adjustment. What are the limitations on the kind of conditions of approval that we can impose on those permits?
I I would turn to the city attorney to confirm, but I don't think we would have any limitations. Oftentimes, we want to be careful that we don't programmatically condition a project because it is difficult to monitor programmatic implementation, but we could do that. So, for instance, to require that they engage with a car share.
Right.
Would be a programmatic
Or a bike
approach.
share, or put in
Right,
more bike
correct.
parking, yeah.
And it would actually be beneficial, I think, to have some support for bike share and car share locally to drive some of those.
I would say, not disagreeing with Andrew's answer at all, but the findings are there's going to have to be a nexus to the findings, so that in a way that's a limit. And if I could just quickly respond to Councilmember Barnacle, the council direction is clear. The challenge that we have right now, that's sort of in the background of my earlier comments, is we're not really in the core general plan discussions and with all that information that we're going to have for that. So that's why we're doing what I think is rightly being perceived as creeping toward the direction, because that's a pretty big change in terms of potential CEQA impacts and other impacts. And again, the policy desire is clear. We're moving in, that's guiding us in the interim. And I think we're going to be in a much stronger place to really address those policy desires when we're really doing that, as we're embarking upon.
Just walk me through the potential CEQA impacts of eliminating parking minimums citywide. Like, I mean, what are the CEQA impacts that I'm overlooking here that we couldn't get passed tonight? That somehow this policy gets passed, but the other one doesn't, when the state's just completely eliminated parking minimums around transit with the exception of hotels. And almost certainly fewer parking spaces probably means fewer vehicle trips, probably fewer vehicle miles traveled. I'm just like, to me, this, like, and when we talk about preparing for the general plan process and inching our way there, the whole conversation tonight has been around, and at the planning commission was around 20 or 25%, and these little things, instead of the programmatic approaches that Councilmember Fisher just raised. That's where I want everybody to be talking about, is how are we going to actually alleviate these trips? Not what is the right threshold by which it's made administratively or not, because I want as many people staying in hotels as possible, and I want us to think about how, once they're here, that they don't use cars.
Well, I think, again, I'm not trying to be debating policy, but what I'm trying to say is, to my thinking, those are citywide circulation issues that we need to address in terms of citywide, the traffic element, for example, in the general plan, and how it works in the regions of the city, in the downtown, and the impacts that it has. And that is not the prep work that was done for this.
Madam Mayor?
Thank you.
Yes, I saw your hand come up.
Okay.
I didn't want to interrupt the city attorney, but since you have, that's okay.
Sorry.
It's all right.
I just want to kind of put a little bit of context, because this was one of the things that we did talk about at Planning Commission. This in no way is trying to distract from the work with what we're doing with a comprehensive parking update. I understand maybe it isn't moving as quickly. Councilmember Barnacle, we are working on it. We're working on it hand in hand with what we're doing for a TDM ordinance. So we're also actively working on that, working with fair and peers, having regular meetings, talking about that. And we're also trying to combine what we might do with private parking regulations and what we're doing with public parking and transit and active transportation. So we're really trying to not look at things in isolation and recognizing how much all of those things work together to create what we're trying to do. And so we're working on all those pieces currently. This came up more quickly, a project that was asking for this amendment for the hotel expansion, And staff viewed this as a way where we could open up some flexibility in the interim while we're figuring out and working on those other pieces.
Thank you for that. And, Kevin McDonald, sorry.
Thank you. I appreciate Councilman Barnacle's perspective on this, and I think that I'm really enjoying the conversation because I think what we're doing is workshopping something. We're communicating with the public on this and advertising that the other is coming down the road and figuring out all kinds of wrinkles that we didn't see or didn't talk about previously. At planning, we did say about the Silk Mill, since that was the case in point that night, that they have a wine bar in there and they have other amenities in there that are not allowed for public because of parking constraints. But if we remove parking constraints, now their wine bar is another facility in the city to use. It's another place for a Rotary breakfast or other convention type gatherings. There's more to talk about on this and more to kind of work through on this. And so, I'm kind of glad that we're getting one shot at this and then bring it around to a policy at a later point.
Does this right here, this ordinance that we're doing tonight, is it going to open their facility up to be used for their wine bar to be used, or is it still have the same sort of prohibitions, if you will?
It was good to see planning have something of a checklist for how they intended to approach this. And so that came up as conversation that it didn't change any on-site use in this conversation. But when we get to parking minimum, I'd be asking that question right away. Do they have the entitlement to change their on-site uses because of a constraint that was from a prior, zoning consideration? And I don't know if we want to answer that tonight or wait for the bigger policy to roll through.
Yeah, I guess I feel like there's so many blessings that come with eliminating parking minimums and getting the regulatory hurdles out of this mess. And this is just another example. That's a great example, council member. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's there's a motion on the floor. We have closed the public hearing. There's a second by Fisher. The first is by Barnacle. And I think we will get a roll call vote unless anyone wants to say anything more. I'm not seeing anyone raise their hand. So I will ask our clerk to go ahead.
Barrett,
Yes.
Barnacle,
Yes.
Fisher,
Yes.
Healy,
Yes.
King,
Yes.
McDonald,
Yes.
Kosake.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, and thank you for a good discussion on this item. First, more to come, I'm sure. And so with that, we will be adjourning, and we will adjourn in the honor of Josh Bocci and Lucy Cordham. Good evening.